We're so happy to have with us today Bill Hart. He's a professor in the Religious Studies Department at Macalester College, and he also is a member of HumanistsMN. His research is at the intersection of religion, ethics, and politics. Bill teaches courses on religion and colonialism, religion and constructions of race, as well as teaching on humanism and atheism. On behalf of everyone here, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Professor Hart. So take it away, Bill.
Right. The first thing I'm going to do is share my screen. Again, let me begin by thanking Audrey and Humanists of Minnesota for inviting me to give this talk. I've addressed this group before. Today's topic is different, but it is thematically related to some of the addresses that I've given in the past. It's related to the events that we've all experienced over the last year or so. This pandemic year has been very long, and we're now in the 13th month of that year, which began in March of last year and is ongoing. You know, you have my sympathy if you've fallen ill to this virus, or if you have family members or friends who've become ill or who've died from this virus. You know, over 500,000 of our fellow citizens have died from COVID-19. Many more have become ill. Some people have been cast into catastrophic financial circumstances as a result of the pandemic. And so I thought that I would shape my comments around the notion of pandemic dis-ease. You'll notice the hyphen. I'm literally talking about COVID-19, but I'm also talking about the multiple forms of dis-ease that we've been feeling over the past year and longer. And so let me just sort of say that I was sort of inspired to sort of think about this a bit by Susan Sontag, who was a great cultural critic who wrote this really interesting book in 1978 called Illness and Metaphor. And she makes the argument that illness is not a metaphor and that we ought not to treat illness as if it's a metaphor. Because what that does, it oftentimes leads us to victim blaming. We blame the victims of illness, disease, and injury for their own maladies. And that's something that we ought not do. And she argues that thinking about disease as a metaphor leads us in that direction. Think about the way in which over history, for example, leprosy was treated, or the way cancer has been treated, and the way in which those diseases get moralized. And we attribute some kind of defect to the person who is suffering from that malady. I actually agree with Sontag, but I also think that sometimes disease is a metaphor. And so I'm going to talk about disease as a metaphor in this presentation. So COVID-19 is a pandemic. And within the midst of that pandemic, we're brought face to face one more time with the pandemic of anti-Blackness, which is nothing new, which is as old as the foundations of this country, and which rears its ugly head in spectacular form from time to time. And of course, I'm referring here to the George Floyd situation and all of the repercussions of that particular event. We can also think about, pandemic levels of gender violence against women and against trans people, pandemic levels of violence against Asian people, from pushing elders to the ground to the horrific mass murder that occurred in Atlanta just a few days ago. And lying behind it, underneath it, and sort of floating above it is a kind of pandemic of lying in our political life. You know, politicians have always lied, but there's something about our most recent president that's taken lying, to a whole new level. So when I think about these multiple forms of, pandemic dis-ease, I think about this trajectory that runs from Reagan to Trump, with Clinton and Obama within that trajectory, in which there's an attack on any kind of unified notion of the American people. I think about, I was coming into my adulthood when Reagan was elected president in 1980. I had graduated from college the year before. And I sat back and listened, as did many other people, to the way in which he demonized poor people and the way he used the trope of welfare queens in particular to demonize poor people. So he demonized poor people, and at the same time, he racialized poor people. Because of course, the image that he knew would pop in people's minds when he talked about welfare queens were Black women receiving welfare. This was part of a larger strategy of demonizing poor people, undermining already an inadequate social safety net, and channeling taxpayer dollars into the pockets of the wealthy. We think more recently of Trump. We think about how Trump even got into presidential politics and how in 2012, he bought into and amplified the conspiracy theory, the racist conspiracy theory that Barack Obama was not an American citizen and therefore was not eligible to be president of the United States. Soon after he's elected, he's talking about Mexican rapists. Remember, around this time, he also expresses distrust in the rulings of a judge and cites that judge's Mexican identity as a reason for his skepticism. Muslim bans, and of course, most recently, the Chinese virus, the racist language of the Chinese virus. And we see how that language has had repercussions among many people. Whether all of these people are his followers or not is really not important. But we see how deadly the repercussions can be when the most powerful person in your country, the most powerful person in the world, uses racist language to describe a virus. This is the kind of thing I think that Susan Sontag had in mind when she argued against the use of diseases as metaphors. And then, of course, there's always the all-purpose fallback of Black people who are constitutively dysfunctional in this way of thinking, as are their countries of origin. Then there was January 6th. And we really do have to ask, what's the future of democracy in this country? Democracy has always been flawed in this country. And it's clearly under attack now in ways that are at least unprecedented in my lifetime. I know we have a prejudice which tells us that things always get better, but things don't always get better. Things can get worse too. I think all of us are experiencing this pandemic year as all of us are discombobulated. Our temporality has been all messed up. So it makes me think about, Shakespeare's, Hamlet, where he talks about time being out of joint. I think that our time is out of joint. The pandemic and all of the other pandemics that I've just mentioned, I think is what's thrown us out of joint. And I would argue that we as citizens, we as a community have an obligation to figure out how to put things right. Behind a lot of the comments that I'm making today stands a recently published book by Heather McGhee called The Sum of Us. And it's subtitled something like The Way Racism Hurts Everyone. And she makes a point in her book about the way, unfortunately, how racial progress, and we just need to put this in black-white terms because that's primarily the kind of pivot or the fulcrum around which this way of thinking turns, that any kind of progress by Black people, for example, is too often perceived by white people as at their expense. So things are viewed in a zero-sum manner, but also this tendency to demonize public goods when those public goods are extended to non-white people and Black people in particular is also something that she talks about. And then you have this bizarre phenomenon, which we saw during the Tea Party years, but we've also seen again, or we saw again during the Trump presidency, in which you would simultaneously have people talking about government spending while asking politicians to keep their hands off their Medicare, as if they don't understand that Medicare is a publicly provided good. That's what happens when we demonize public goods and give some public goods an invidious Black face. This is one of the consequences. This is an old game played in this country. Moneyed white elites use racism to prevent solidarity among non-elites across racial lines. It's as old as the post-slavery period, when bosses pitted white workers against Black workers. And by doing so, were able to pay all workers lower wages, provide them with deficient benefits, and so it goes. You may not be familiar, you may be surprised to hear me say this, but I'm something of an anti-racist. And you might say, well, what is that? Or how could that be? Why would you describe yourself as an anti-racist? And I'll tell you why I would say that. Because too often, anti-racism becomes a strategy used by white elites to keep things more or less the same. So you incorporate non-white elites into various sectors of the economy, various sectors of power, but you keep everything else the same. So Black elites benefit, other non-white elites benefit, but the vast majority of people who are not elites, including white people, don't benefit and even suffer. And this is rooted in what we call the split labor market theory. And again, this is the notion of why there's never been a viable socialist party in the United States, or even a viable labor party in the United States, because since the abolition of slavery, bosses have successfully pitted white workers against Black workers, undermining the power of all workers. And of course, that's a divide and conquer strategy. The white moneyed elites eat us alive. Notice I say first iteration because I'm going to come back to this again in slightly different forms. But I think that this is a really, really important point here that I want to linger on just a little bit. There are a lot of things that Americans don't like to talk about. Two things that Americans don't like to talk about in particular are history, especially when it's not a patriotic, celebratory history, but one that urges us to grapple with difficult things. And we don't like to talk about class. We pretend that everybody in this country is middle class. Jeff Bezos is middle class. People who can barely make the rent or who can't make the rent are middle class. Because we evacuate class language of its economic content and we replace it with value-laden language, so that class signifies certain character dispositions as opposed to economic realities. It took 150 years, but the Confederate flag finally made it into the capital of the United States. I never thought it would happen. It took 151 years. The Union won the Civil War, the Confederacy won the peace. And we know the Confederacy won the peace because virtually every single state in the country, including states that did not even exist at the time of the Civil War, are home to Confederate monuments. Even as I speak, the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, Nathan Forrest, a bust of him sits in the Capitol in the state of Tennessee. So the Union won the Civil War, the Confederacy won the peace, the Confederate flag has made it into the Capitol, and our most recent president was a neo-Confederate president. We've all heard the saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Things have changed. Things have changed dramatically since 1870. And yet, we see this really interesting continuity between 1870, when the Ku Klux Klan Act was passed, and 2021. Both pivot around the same phenomenon. That is the attempt to suppress the vote of Black people. Ku Klux Klan used fear, violence, and intimidation to try to prevent Black men from voting after the passage of the 15th Amendment, which granted Black men the right to vote. This act was necessary to tamp down on Ku Klux Klan intimidation and violence. And in 2020, 2021, we see new efforts to suppress the Black vote and the votes of anyone associated with the Black vote. Lee Atwater. Lee Atwater was a strategist for both Ronald Reagan and for George H.W. Bush. I'm not sure if he advised the younger Bush or not, but he certainly advised the elder Bush. I know everyone here can read, but I'm going to read this. You start out in 1954 saying, nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes. And all these things you're talking about are total economic things. And a byproduct of them is Blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger nigger. This is one of the clearest and most concise accounts of how coded language works. and the way in which you can speak in coded language and in invidious ways about Black people and mobilize white fears for political purposes that's ever been written. And while we are no longer faced by the controversy around busing, taxes, or cutting taxes and welfare are certainly continue to be code words for the threat that non-white people and Black people in particular pose. And of course, I would add to this list crime, the way in which crime signifies in our language and the way in which it functions as a code word. Some of you may or may not be familiar with the Voting Rights Act. One of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act is Section 5, which makes states with a proven history of suppressing the Black votes have to meet certain kinds of standards in the way in which they manage their voting. That was overturned in 2013, and immediately states in the former Confederacy, but not only states in the former Confederacy, other states as well, rushed in to pass legislation that would make it harder for Black people in particular, but again, any vote associated with the Black vote, to make it harder for them to vote. So just in case you've forgotten or if you've never known, here's a real short refresher course in voter suppression and what it looks like. So on my screen on the left side, you have Jim Crow 101, first iteration of Jim Crow. Poll taxes say that if you can't pay, you can't vote. Literacy test says if you can't read or you can't read to our satisfaction, you can't vote. Grandfather clauses say if your grandparent voted, you can vote, even if you can't pay the poll tax and you can't pass the literacy test. This was a way of getting around the unintended effects of the poll tax and literacy test, which were passed to suppress the Black vote, but had the unintended consequence of suppressing a lot of white vote as well. The grandfather clause was a way of getting around the white suppressive effects of the poll tax and the literacy test. Then there was a white primary where Black voters were simply banned from participating in primaries. They could only vote for candidates in the general election. As we all know, oftentimes the real work of politics occurs during the primary season, when the really important decisions are made and not during the general election. Then, of course, there's violence and intimidation. There was a recent Supreme Court case, a decision, it might have been an appellate court decision, where the judge talked about the way in which certain states were targeting Black voters with surgical precision. And essentially what he meant was that they would simply find out what Black people did to successfully get out the vote and make it illegal. And as with Jim Crow 1.0, there is white collateral damage. But unfortunately, so many members of the current GOP are willing to disenfranchise some white voters, a few white voters, if it means they can suppress the vote of many Black voters. And I mean, yes, look at this farce that's playing itself out in Georgia, where two top Republican officials, the governor and the Secretary of State, under death threats, have reiterated over and over again that the election was among the cleanest elections ever had, that it was a perfectly clean election. And yet in Georgia, that legislature and legislatures dominated by the GOP across the country are passing what they call voter integrity laws. And this is rooted in a very, very old law that comes out of Reconstruction. One of the arguments made for suppressing the Black vote during Reconstruction is that Black people were incapable of exercising the rights of citizenship, that Black people were corrupt, and that Black people were especially susceptible to being corrupted, and therefore they ought not be allowed to vote. And a version of that argument was being made by Trump and the GOP, especially when they wanted to target 4 states, and not even 4 states, 4 cities or particular districts within those cities that had a heavy African-American vote. It's the same principle at work. So over 250 bills have been introduced in state legislatures across the country since January 6th, since January 20th, when Biden was elected, confirmed as president, or I should say inaugurated as president, sworn as a president. And they're all designed to make voting more difficult. And the target of these efforts in the first instance are Black voters and any vote associated with the Black vote, which tends to be a Democratic vote of various kinds. Now, these restrictions will hurt a lot of white voters, and it will hurt some of the voters of the Republican Party, but they're willing to do this with the belief that it's going to hurt, and we can think about Lee Atwater again, that it's going to hurt Black voters a lot more than it's going to hurt white voters. And that will be enough to undermine the narrow margin that the Democratic Party needs to win elections. Notice the language here has changed a little bit. First slide like this, I said that the white moneyed elites eat us alive. Here I'm saying that the multiracial elite, moneyed elites eat us alive. Because the elites eat us alive. And they eat us alive in part because racist solidarity blinds us to the necessity of class solidarity. So I think before I let me check my time. Time is, I'll just keep going.
You're doing
Sorry.
good, I think, unless you, I think
well,
you're doing
there was an audio clip that I wanted to play. So a video clip that I want to play. So let me see if, let me stop sharing, I think. We'll come back and let me see if I can do this. I'm going to play this clip because the person says it better than I can. And so she ought to say it. So let me make sure that I share my sound with you. And if you can't hear it, someone flag my attention quickly. Harlan, you're on my screen, so if you guys can't hear this, let me know immediately.
And the rest of the hour with Heather McGee, author of the new book,
hear it.
Some of Us, What Racism
Can you make it full screen?
And How We Can Prosper Together. Heather is the board chair of Color of Change and former president of the think tank Demos. Thanks so much for joining us, Heather. Congratulations on your new book.
Thank you. Congratulations on 25 years.
Thank you so much. The whole team at Democracy Now! Is celebrating. Hopefully soon we can celebrate together. Well, yeah. You just sat there and watched once again the Reverend Warnock. You tweeted while he was speaking and said everyone should do themselves a favor and watch this speech. Can you talk about the significance of what happened in Georgia for this whole country? Reverend Warnock, the first Black Democrat to be elected from the former Confederacy.
Yeah, it was so moving. I mean, I really think of the crucible of the 24 hours between January 5th and January 6th as American promise and American peril in a nutshell. First, we saw a multiracial coalition, a multiracial anti-racist coalition that was standing up to 4 years of division, pain, and suffering, and putting the man who is the successor to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, marching through the pews of that storied church and putting him in office along with John Ossoff. That was an historic moment. So many of the political class had counted Georgia out, and yet a coalition that went from Black folks who had been organizing for years with Stacey Abrams and LaTosha Brown, to white women in the suburbs who turned away from the Republican Party for the first time in generations, young people really overcoming a number of barriers to the ballot in the middle of a pandemic, did the impossible with the promise of relief from this pandemic, itself a disease that has wreaked havoc disproportionately on people of color, but that has shown that our fates are inextricably linked. And then not 24 hours later, the dark spirit of American white supremacy, fueled by a big lie that has as its core logic racism, the idea, the common sense that, of course, a man who was rejected by the majority of people of color could not possibly have lost the presidency, that, of course, when people of color vote, it is somehow suspect and criminal. This is the tension, and I explore this tension in my book because fundamentally, racism has been the most powerful tool wielded against the best of America, against American democracy, against cross-racial solidarity, against the American dream itself. I talk about how it's brought us the inequality era, and figures like Reverend Warnock, who put into perspective, who in their own lives have so much of the course of American history on display, are whom we need to look to right now to remind us that that tool always robs this country of its best promise.
You mentioned Stacey Abrams. Georgia's state Senate recently approved a bill that would end the right of voters to cast absentee ballots without excuse while toughening voter ID requirements. Georgia voting rights activist, the former gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams, blasted the legislation on CNN.
I do absolutely agree that it's racist. It is a redux of Jim Crow in a suit and tie. We know that the only thing that precipitated these changes, it's not that there was a question of security. In fact, the Secretary of State and the governor went to great pains to assure America that Georgia's elections were secure. And so the only connection that we can find is that more people of color voted, and it changed the outcome of elections in a direction that Republicans do not like.
So that's Stacey Abrams. And of course, it's not just Georgia, it's all over the country. Over 250 bills now introduced in legislatures around the country, as you've said. I mean, the idea of the Republicans, what, if you can't beat them, enjoin them? Like, just legally stop them from voting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's be very clear that this is the question that has bedeviled this nation since its founding. are we going to be a democracy or are we going to be a white supremacist state? Our founders had a revolutionary idea to break with the European tradition of monarchy and bet on the radical idea of self-governance, and yet they compromised their own ideals from the start to compromise with slavery. They drilled holes into the bedrock of American democracy at the beginning with compromises such as the Electoral College to ensure a voice for slave states, the three-fifths compromise, and then, of course, allowing the first Congress to delineate citizenship only to free white citizens, free white persons. And so we've seen time and time again, all of these tactics are from a very old playbook. They're from a playbook that is deployed by a narrow white elite. And the thing that I try to outline in my book, I have a whole chapter on the way that democracy has always been subverted by racism, deployed by a narrow white elite, is that the costs of these kinds of voter suppression tactics, both in the Jim Crow era and today, of course, hit their target, right? Of course, they disproportionately and first and worst impact Black Americans and brown and indigenous Americans whom they're targeting, but they also impact young people of all races. They make it harder for white people to vote as well. This is why, when Demos took a case to the Supreme Court against the purges of the voter rolls for people who had just not voted in an election in 2 elections in a row, our lead plaintiff was Larry Harmon, a white, middle-aged Ohioan Navy veteran. This is what happens. People get caught in a trap not set for them. During the Jim Crow era, the southern states suffered a slow death of civic life. It was because of things like the poll tax and the grandfather clause and the restrictions by force on the right to vote. It meant that working class white people didn't vote either, and it meant that there was one-party rule by a white segregationist elite that didn't even have to compete for votes, and so it didn't invest in the South. It left the South lagging behind on core public investments, because when you don't have a functioning democracy, you don't have public goods, you don't have a thriving economy. That's the Republicans' vision. They want a plantation democracy and a plantation economy, but we're not going to let them have that.
So let's talk about the central image of your new book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone, and how we can prosper together. Let's talk about that swimming pool, a drained swimming pool, Heather.
So my book is about the way that after 20 years of trying to do what I thought was very sensible, which was bring economic data and to policymakers to get them to make better economic policy decisions, I left the think tank world and went on a journey across the country. And one of the first trips that I made was to Montgomery, Alabama, where there's a central park called Oak Park. And it used to be really the beating heart of the city. And in the middle of Oak Park, there used to be one of what was at one point nearly 2,000 grand resort-style public swimming pools. And these weren't just any kinds of swimming pools. These were pools that held over 1,000 swimmers at a time, and they were built in a building boom of public amenities in the 1930s and 40s. In the New Deal era, Amy, where we saw a government ethos that said it is the government's job to lift the standard of living of our people, to provide protections for workers, to invest in a heretofore completely unthought of idea, which is that working class people would be able to own a home with no down payment and stretching it out over 30 years, through to the GI Bill, which was a massive investment in economic security and created a white middle class. And I say a white middle class because virtually all of those public investments and protections that I just described were for whites only, either by design, such as with the mortgage market and the redlined housing maps, to the GI Bill, which was race neutral on its face, but excluded millions of Black GIs. The swimming pools across the country, in so many places, not just in the South, were also segregated and for whites only. And when the civil rights movement empowered Black families to say, hey, those are our tax dollars, we want our kids to swim too, what did white-controlled towns do instead of integrating them? All across the country, but definitely in Oak Park in Montgomery, Alabama, where I visited, they drained the public pool rather than integrate them. They took out the water, poured in dirt, seeded it over with grass. In Montgomery, they kept the entire Parks and Recreation Department closed for a decade to avoid integration. I went, as I said, to Oak Park, and I walked the grounds. Even after they reopened the park, they never rebuilt the pool. And for me, that was a perfect image of what's happened to the American economy. As the majority of white voters turned their backs on the party of the New Deal, the party that had really guaranteed middle-class security for white America when that promise was extended across the color line during the civil rights movement. And Lyndon Johnson then became the last Democrat to win the majority of white voters, even until today.
I wanted.
So I'm going to stop there. I mean, I think that piece by Heather McGhee is powerful, and it says so much of what I wanted to say. And so I made it easy on myself by playing that 10 minutes of her talk. But I mean, I think it's revealing. I think she puts her finger right on the issue. And, you know, this sense that we feel that things are out of joint, I think is the proper feeling. And I think that we have to do the work. That is, we as American people have to do the work. We have to change the kind of politics in which we engage. We need to end what she describes as drain the pool politics. It's a very powerful kind of politics still in America. We can turn Americans, especially white Americans, against the provision of public goods, against the provision of social goods, by giving those public and social goods a Black face. And these are some of the kinds of things that I think that we need to do if we're going to move away from this kind of politics. I think that we have to get out of this sort of politics of tax cutting, austerity, which has defined the Republican Party since Ronald Reagan. If there's any upside to President Trump at all, it's that he abandoned that kind of thinking, and he might have opened the door for the Biden administration and for future administrations to step away from that kind of politics, which tells the public that we can't do anything for ordinary people because it's too expensive. In a repetitive and routine way, whenever there's any kind of crisis in the capitalist system, we can give hundreds of billions, even trillions of dollars to the wealthiest corporations in America without a second thought, but we don't have enough money to help ordinary people. And it may be that in addition to stepping away from tax cutting austerity, is that we need to begin to think about living wages. You know, I was heartened by the Fight for 15 movement. I think that kind of movement is looking in the right direction. We have to start paying people a living wage in this country. We have to find some way of moving toward universal health care. So-called Obamacare is better than nothing, but it's a Rube Goldberg device. And there are much more direct and streamlined ways of providing universal health care. We certainly could have used it and can use it in the current pandemic. We need to continue to move and move more aggressively, you know, away from our fossil fuel infrastructure to a green infrastructure. We need to do it because the planet demands that we do it, but also because we know that there are good, high-paying jobs that will come from that transition to a green infrastructure. If the recent crisis in Texas hasn't taught us anything, at least should have taught us that. And finally, we have to find some way of expanding the notion of who an American is. Unfortunately, from very early on, from the Naturalization Act of 1790, when citizenship was defined as white persons, we struggle with this persistent idea that there are real Americans and fake Americans, first-class Americans and second-class Americans. And those notions have always pivoted around race. And we've got to find a way of breaking out of that, and by thinking about American identity and the common welfare in expansive terms. I guess I'm not going to say much about this because we're running short on time, but I do want to make the point that I think that the language of racial disparities that we've been hearing a lot of recently is not the best way of talking about what's going on. I think that exploitation is the better term, and that the language of racial disparities is generated by forms of economic exploitation which cut across class. You think about the struggle that's going on among Amazon workers right now. Those Amazon workers are multiracial. The issue isn't one of disparity, but it's one of cross-racial exploitation, and we need to tackle that problem of cross-racial exploitation. I'm moving a little bit more quickly now than I would have because, again, I want to save time for questions. I mean, I know that everyone is not going to agree with all the things that I have here, but I really do believe that the deregulation regime and the privatization regime that we've been under since the rise of Ronald Reagan has greatly degraded the provision of public goods. I think that the rug has been pulled out from under labor, and the fact that labor has been disempowered explains a lot of the kind of malaise that we're experiencing around our economic lives. And finally, I think that we need to promote universal programs. And I know some people don't like universal programs because they say those programs provide people who already have resources with resources that they don't need. But if we look at those public programs that are the most popular and the most successful, like Medicare, like Social Security, these are programs that are universal, that people get regardless of their income. And they have broad racial, public support. Then you think about those programs that have been targeted toward poor people, they tend to be mean tested. And that mean testing is racialized. And it undermines public support for those programs. So I think that we need to move from means-tested programs to universal programs. And finally, we have to move toward a society in which is not rooted in ethnos, that's not rooted in a particular notion of who the people are, but that's rooted in the values that we share. I'm not going to say much here other than to say that we need to learn how to disconnect responsibility, guilt from responsibility. Some people will hear a presentation such as the one that I'm giving, they feel guilty and they say, well, I didn't do that. People need to understand that one can be obligated to fix something even though you were not guilty of breaking it. Here I think about the late great German theologian, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who criticized the church of his time and talked about how they wanted cheap grace how grace is costly, and I would say that solidarity is costly as well. If we want real solidarity, the kind of solidarity that can push back against the kind of politics that's tormented us over the last few decades, then we have to build real solidarity. And real solidarity has to be a cross-racial solidarity, a solidarity that does not allow racist forms of solidarity to dupe it. If we are to be one, if from, our plurality, from our manyness, we are to become one, then if we don't do it now, I don't know when we will do it. Okay, I'm going to end right there. I kind of rushed through the final slides because I wanted to reserve some time for discussion. And anyway,
Thank you so
that I
much,
provoked some thoughts.
Professor Hart. That was great. A lot of food for thought there. Harlan, yes, clapping, clapping aloud. So I'm going to turn it over to Harlan now to run the Q&A.
Thank you, Audrey, for putting this program together. And thank you, Bill, for your wonderful presentation. We're going to be taking questions now, and I'm going to try it both ways now. You could, if I see you, if you want to be recognized to this, or there's a feature on Zoom, it's a virtual hand, and I see Santa Eric has already done it. And the good thing about it is they sort of line people up. They put people in a cube, and so I could tell the order that questions should be taken. So I'm going to first ask Santa Eric to ask his question, to be followed by Jerry Smith and then George. Santa Eric?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hart. I really appreciated your talk. I want to ask you about property and how property and kind of the Christian white idea of property as going back, pre-revolutionary period, even before the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade, and how that is, informs your notion of why class and class solidarity is important and maybe even more important than racial solidarity.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. I mean, I think that there are some useful features of Christian-derived notions of property that preceded the modern period, and especially that precede Locke's notion of what property is, John Locke's notion of property, which has sort of stereotyped the way we think about, property in the United States, and that, that property, even private property, is not something that you can sort of own absolutely, and that you can use without any kind of regard to the public will, the public good at all. And that sometimes the public has legitimate claims on what you might otherwise regard as your private property.
This is kind of gets to what I really got from your speech is that the commons and the privatization of the commons is really causing our problem, because the way I look at it, property issues at the beginning, chattel slavery, the enslaved people as property, and then carving up the land as we did after the founding fathers, took their maps that they got grants from the king. And now we're talking about data and people's attention and people's eyeballs is the property that we're selling. And that's turned this, this commons areas for commerce and education and science and government, all those commons areas have been shrunk to almost nothing.
Right. Which is why we need to push back hard against any kind of Lockean notion of property. I mean, especially when we when we extend that notion of property to digital bytes, you know, or to the intellectual realm at all, we create, or when we extend those Lockean notion of property to our DNA.
I'd like to call on our board member, Jerry Smith.
Yes. Thanks for the presentation, Bill. I agree with the goal that you laid out of e pluribus unum, of having unity and being all together. But I disagree with some of the account that was made, and particularly, while I certainly think this country has had huge racial problems that trace back to the founding and haven't gone away, there's a tendency, it seems to me, to over-racialize things, to see all conflicts as matters of race, when in fact there might be other drivers. And I think that's the case here. I think it was the case with the video you had with Heather McGee. She talked about the Electoral College as having been established for racial reasons. Historically, I don't think that's even close to being true. But when you talk about voting and the current efforts by Republicans to restrict voting rights, and making that was basically an attempt to restrict Black voting, I would argue it's basically an attempt to restrict Democratic or liberal votes. That's what they're trying to do. And they're trying to, that carries over to Black votes because Black people tend to vote for Democrats, sure. But I don't think it's primarily directed, except in maybe some areas, I don't think it's primarily directed at Black people per se because they're Black. And to support that position, I would point out that some of these efforts to restrict voting are focused on college students. Now, college students are not predominantly Black, but they are predominantly liberal. And so the attempt is to make it harder for them to vote so that reduce the number of liberal voters and thereby make it easier for Republicans to win. And so what underlies this, I would argue, is not so much Black versus white racism, and I don't deny that that exists, but I don't think that's what's going on here. What underlies it is a basic difference of philosophy about this country. There's the conservative, Republican, rugged individualistic, we're all on our own, capitalist, raw capitalism kind of thing. And then there's the more social democratic, liberal, communitarian, we got to do things collectively. The government is there to help us prosper collectively. Those two different philosophies are driving the voting and driving most of politics in this country. So I think it's important to appreciate that rather than to turn it into a Black versus white thing when that is not the primary driver, at least in my opinion. So I just wanted to throw that out and see how you'd react to that.
I mean, I appreciate your comments, and I agree that it's important not to over-racialize. I guess we just disagree, though, about how much race actually explains what's going on. And I also think that my account was a lot more nuanced than your description of my account, because I think I said repeatedly that it's focused on Black vote and vote that's associated with Black vote. And, you know, even during the Jim Crow era, white elites were perfectly willing to disenfranchise white voters because what matters in politics is margins. And on their view, that if some white voters got disenfranchised and a whole lot of Black voters got disenfranchised, that's perfectly fine. Then they sort of remedied part of that problem with the grandfather class so that they could disenfranchise Black voters who could not read or who could not pay a poll tax without disenfranchising white voters who also could not pay the poll tax and who could not read. If you look at the way in which voter suppression works today, it's almost always targeted in the first instance. I didn't say only, in the first instance at Black voters. You can't make sense of voter suppression in this country without efforts to repress the Black vote in particular, which is why I said the Black vote and vote that's associated with the Black vote. That's so. I mean, I agree with your, I agree with your notion that we ought not overly racialize. I think you and I simply disagree about what an appropriate account of the racial animus that drives this is. We just disagree. I mean, I hear you and I understand your account, and I think it's a reasonable argument, but I think the evidence is more on my side than yours.
Why don't we have another
Yeah.
comment from Jerry and then the next question?
I mean, I question whether they would be trying to suppress black votes if blacks voted for Republicans predominantly. If they endorsed that Republican view of the country, I don't think they'd be trying to suppress black votes, except in some areas, because I think in some areas of this country, there still is this very strong kind of racist. But I don't think that's as pronounced as the different views of what society should be like and what government should do. I think that's a stronger driver. But you're right.
Racism is always driven by other motives. You know, Black people weren't enslaved because, you know, 17th century Europeans hated Black people. They were enslaved because it was easier to enslave them. They were enslaved because it was economically profitable to enslave them. They had already tried to slave the indigenous people. That did not work. White indentured servants were essentially slaves. They simply were slaves for a term of indenture as opposed to being slaves in perpetuity. So racism has always had is always driven by other interests. It's driven by economic interests. So, I mean, I agree with you. I think we just disagree on how much weight we should place on the racial animus.
Okay.
George, you have a question?
Sure. You spoke about electoral reform, and each side has its vision of electoral reform. And Democrats want to make it as easy as possible for every citizen to vote, and Republicans are proposing measures to make voting more difficult. Now, I think the supporters of the Democrats have an easier time to look upon their goal as principled, whereas in order for a Republican to look upon it as principled, he has to really fear that if everyone is allowed to vote without encumbrance, that elections are going to be stolen by the Democrats, and that seems to be such a far-fetched hope. I mean, you nicely in your presentation pointed out the different ways in which this voter suppression is being pursued. But how is it that people are supporting them?
I'm sorry, how is it that people are supporting whom?
Are supporting the Republicans when
right.
so
clearly, I think my presentation was an attempt to explain why it is that's the case. And I've talked about the way in which throughout American history, it continues to happen today, racist forms of solidarity trump cross-racial class forms of solidarity. And it has since slavery, and especially since the abolition of slavery, when employers were, confronted with the prospect of white workers and Black workers joining together in unions. And they cultivated in white workers what the historian W.E. Du Bois what he calls the wages of whiteness. This is one of my screens. I did not talk about this. And this is the notion that even if you are as poor as your fellow Black worker, or maybe even if you're poorer than your fellow Black worker, at least you're white. It's called the wages of whiteness. It's a psychic wage, which is why also many poor white people don't like to be called poor, because poor has been racialized. To be poor is to be Black. Because poor in the first instance isn't about the absence of money or resources, but it's about various character flaws and various behavioral dispositions that people who are poor, read Black people, have. It's that kind of thinking that has people at least according to some of our views, voting against their interests. But of course, people have more than economic interests. They have honor-based interests. And in this country, honor focuses primarily on race. Well, gender, and race.
Suzanne, do you have a question?
Non-white people, but especially Black people, are
Sorry.
by definition without honor. And you can see this work even in our language. I mean, I know some people get mad when I say this, but take a term that maybe even many of you use. I can't hear the term white trash without hearing a profoundly racist term. Because what underlies that concept of white trash is that white trash, I'll just put it bluntly, white trash are white people who act like Black people. Because the normative condition of Black people is that they're trashy. The normative condition of white people is they're not trashy. When white people act in trashy ways, they're acting in ways that are beneath their race. It's a deeply racist term. It's a deeply class-latent term, but it's also a deeply racist term. That's another way in which people around racist solidarity don't understand the economic solidarity, the economic conditions they actually share with other people. We oftentimes forget that there are still numerically more poor white people in this country than there are poor white Black people.
Suzanne, you have a question?
Yeah.
She's our vice president.
Hi. I was interested in your comments about the need to universalize programs so that they're not racialized. And I was thinking, you know, going back to the pandemic, which is something you started with, it seems to have had one silver lining in that it has paved the way for at least the near-term future to programs like that. I just find the American Recovery Act amazing that our country, you know, because I'm old enough to remember Reagan and the welfare queens and welfare reform and all kinds of resistance to any kind of help for poor people. And all of a sudden we have this amazing program where everybody gets a stimulus payment. There's a monthly childcare credit for people, just things that I feel like wouldn't have been possible even a couple of years ago. So I guess my question is, do you think this is any kind of permanent shift, or is it just a response to a crisis that will go away in another year or two?
I don't know. I hope it's a permanent shift. And that's why, you know, it may be a backhanded compliment, but I mean it sincerely. I mean, I despise Trump with everything in my, but even though he's a con man and he really doesn't care about poor people, he really doesn't care about, I should be blunt about it, he really doesn't care about poor white people. He was able to project an image and speak in ways that made poor white people think that he cares about them. Although if you look at his actual policies, I mean, he cut taxes for the rich and did all kinds of things. But there was some genuine populist aspects to the way Trump did things. He did not worry about, for example, deficit spending the way the traditional Republican, Reagan, and onward have. Even their worry about deficits was fake, because they really only worried about deficits when money was being spent for ordinary people. They have no problem spending billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, even trillions of dollars. I mean, think about all of the financial crises. Those of us who are old enough to remember. I mean, 2009, that was just the latest in, it seemed like every 10 years there was some major financial crisis. The credit and loan, you know, crisis of the 1980s. The government bails out these rich sectors of the economy to the tune of billions of dollars. You think about the Enron and we can just count countless examples of where there's some kind of economic collapse in the elite sector and money is poured in right away. and they're not demonized as undeserving welfare recipients, even though they get many, many times the money that any welfare recipient could ever, get. So to answer your question, it might be that Trump has succeeded in destroying the Republican Party that Reagan built, a party that cut taxes and reduce public provision of goods. It may be that he's destroyed that, not because he's actually for a greater provision of public goods, but because that was just part of his stick, and because he actually had a genuine dislike of other elites whose clubs he could never really get in. Now, I agree. The Relief Act just passed is magnificent in many ways because it incorporates many things that that socialists have been wanting to do for a long time, including the provision of some kind of universal basic income. I mean, just look at the massive amounts of money that are in there for poor people. I've never seen anything like it. Even if you go back to the Great Society programs of Lyndon Johnson, you didn't quite see money pouring in like this, for people at the lower end of the economy. So I would have never thought that something like this would have been done under a Biden administration who was talking about cutting taxes in the late 1970s before Reagan was ever elected president. So that's the wing of the Democratic Party that he came out of. So I'm surprised to see it. I'm amazed to see it. Whether it represents a permanent shift, I don't know. There seem to not be permanent shifts in American society. It's really dangerous to predict. I can remember after Obama's 2012 election, pundits were breathlessly talking about how the Republicans would never run an election again.
Okay, I'm going to call on Christine and then Joseph to follow. Christine, you have a question?
Joseph put his hand up first, so I'll go after him.
No, but your virtual hand, I think, came up first.
Okay, well, I know he had his hand up, but anyway, he'll go. I have seen information and kind of doing visual or Zooms and webinars with the Poor People's Campaign. You referenced Dr. Hart about how laws, yes, put in place, the motivation may be to most impact and target Black folks, and also it impacts, yes, white folks. I think I heard you say something that made me think you're not feeling real confident about chances for success of helping all folks. Because if the target is mostly Black folks, then you know what, poor folks are never, I'm not trying to misstate what you said. I guess my question is, what is the likelihood of success? How likely will it be to make progress on this, on an issue that touches so many people across any background?
Yeah, before answering that part of the question, let me sort of go back. I don't think that in voting suppression, I do think in the first instance, Black voters trying to be suppressed, that's the paradigm case. But I mean, just to be blunt about it, the way the economy works in such a way as to try to provide resources upwards to elites at the expense of everybody else. Race is used to inhibit people coming together in solidarity to prevent the elites from capturing most of the economic wealth that's produced in the country. So those practices are racialized because racializing them is a way of splitting, I'm just being reductive here, splitting Black and white labor. We know that labor is way more complicated than Black and white, but it's an effective tool and always has been an effective tool of splitting solidarity among Black and white labor. If I had played that tape a little bit longer on, she talks about going down to Canton, Mississippi, and about an organizing campaign that was going on at a Nissan plant. my wife happens to be from Canton, Mississippi, so I go there a lot. I see the plant every time I drive in. In fact, back in 2017, a few organizers actually came to Macalester College, and I and some other faculty met with them and had conversations about, about their organizing efforts. And, the company succeeded in splitting white and Black workers there. The vast majority of the workers who had been successfully organized in the union were Black, which sort of flips the script of the way things have historically worked. Historically, unions have been white in part because they also discriminated against Blacks. And bosses would hire Blacks as strike breakers, sort of exacerbating the enmity between white workers and Black workers. So that's always been a strategy to keep the elite. And what used to be an almost exclusively white elite is increasingly elite that is multicultural. And those non-white elites have the same class interests that the white elites do.
Joseph.
Okay.
To answer the question that I did not answer about success.
Oh, let's go back to the professor.
I hope for success, but the history of this country makes me, I won't say be skeptical, but to be cautious.
Okay. Okay, can I go now? So
go ahead, Joseph.
Okay, my question was about if you could expand on what you meant by that you're an anti-racist and what
Sure.
that means, because I've read an article by Ibram Kendi,
right.
That he wrote the book How to Be an Anti-Racist. So
right.
He seems to have a very similar definition that you have. So his article that he wrote was, it's policy that's racist. It's not education and love that will solve the problem.
Right.
So that's just my question. That it's really, I mean, it's very smart people thinking of intricate systems, but that are nonetheless racist. So I guess that's my question. If you could expand on what it means to be an anti-racist.
Sure. I mean, Kenny and I certainly agree that policy is more important. And it might be that our agreements are actually broader than that, but there is an anti-racism industry. It's here at Macalester College. If you just followed the news after the George Floyd murder, you had all of these corporations, saying Black Lives Matter. Look, when commercial corporations in America begin to say Black Lives Matter, then that term has simply become a slogan. And what it has become is a marketing slogan. And the way in which the elite sectors of the American economy are dealing with anti-Blackness is not by trying to transform the American social system so that people across races, especially people at the lower end of the economy, have a fair chance in this economy. What they simply want to do is to bring Black and other non-white elites into the club. The game remains the same. The game remains one in which the elites get 90%, of the profit generated by the economy, and those at the bottom get zero. You don't change the system by bringing, a few Black elites and other non-white elites into the club. You keep that system in place. I advocate for a system where all of the resources produced by the economy don't go, and it's not just the top 1%, it may be more like the top 10%, don't go to the top percent of wealth earners, of income and wealthy people in this country, where people across the board have a fair chance. It's precisely because so many American people know that the game is rigged against them, but they don't have a set of they don't have the proper analysis or a set of tools to make sense out of it. And so they fall prey to demagogues like Trump, who tell them that, that the Mexicans are taking their jobs. Now, that is partly true. On the lowest end of the economic scale, immigration creates competition with low-wage workers, and quite frankly, elites, and elites across party. Clinton and Obama were no better in this regard. They were solicitous of the elite classes in this country and indifferent, if not contemptuous, to the lower orders in this country. That's why I say there's a continuity from Reagan to Trump, with Clinton very explicitly trying to triangulate, that is, trying to pull traditional Democratic policies closer to Reaganite Republican policies. That's what triangulation was. And Obama was simply a redux of that. He was simply a repetition. Although he was less skilled politician than Bill Clinton was, Obama was simply repeating in a less skillful manner what Clinton did. They took the Reagan Revolution as given, as the way things ought to be, which is precisely why, instead of using the resources he had, Obama came in, he could have been, Obama for a minute was very powerful. The economy had collapsed. He was president. The Republicans were in retreat. He could have pushed through very big, bold programs. But what did he do? He pushed through a program that favored Wall Street. Look at all the money that was given to Wall Street and the banks that could have been given to underwater homeowners. He could have done that, but he didn't do it because he thinks about the world and he thinks about the economy the way other elites do. And that's the problem with our politics. It keeps giving us candidates for president, regardless of party, who are solicitous of elites and indifferent to ordinary people, and especially the poor. Think about the way in which the term poor has disappeared from the vocabulary of politicians. Even Obama can't say poor. Goes back to the earlier point I made about how we don't like to talk about class in this country. Everybody's middle class. We need to do something about the middle class. Well, what about ordinary people who aren't middle class, who are poor? And again, the kind of politics generated by this country since Reagan has been contemptuous of ordinary people. Hell, Nixon, as terrible as he was, and as big a threat to our constitutional order he was, and as terrible as of the things that he did, internationally, in terms of Vietnam and elsewhere, Nixon did more for Black people and poor people in general than Obama did, or Clinton for that matter.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry I'm getting worked up because this stuff really does work me up.
Well, that's okay. Well, thank you. You know, we're now at 4:30 or 4:34, and normally the Q&A is over at this time, and I want to thank you for your deft handling of some of these interesting questions. And now we're going to follow with social hour.